Hello and welcome to the Print Softcover, our online venue where we launch non-fiction books. My name is Devdatta, and today we have a very special guest with us, writer, playwright, author, and translator Farrukh Dhondy. He's known for his diverse literary work, including children's books, biographies, plays, and film scripts. And today we are going to talk about his latest book, Rumi, a New Selection, which has been published by HarperCollins. This is the book, and I have to mention that it has a magnificent cover image. I hope everyone can see. Now, the book offers a deep exploration of the life and works of Jalal al-Din Rumi, one of the most widely read poets globally. It delves into his poetry, its strong ties to Sufi Islamic thought, and how it has been adopted for a modern Western audience. Now, he brings Rumi's poetry to life in a way that ensures the lyrical mysticism and melody of Rumi's original works remain intact. So, without any further ado, let's begin our conversation with the author of this book itself. Welcome to the Print, Farrukh. To begin with, you have written two books earlier on Rumi, one in 2011 and one in 2020. 5 years later, my first question to you is what is different about this third selection, as you call it, and how does it differ from your other works on Rumi? I would like you to tell our audience what was behind the selection of these particular poems, parables, and aphorisms.
Okay. Rumi, the 13th century poet, is extremely prolific. He has sometimes been called, his work has been called the Quran in verse. Some would deny that. The Wahhabi Islamists would say no, Wahhabi Muslims would say no, Sufism is not Islam. But of course, Sufism is the Islam that came to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. It was brought by Sufi missionaries. And Persia and even Turkey, right, have fairly strong Sufi traditions. Now, his Rumi's main work was called the Masnavi, and the Masnavi is 28,000 verses. Right, that's a lot of verses, a lot of books, 6 books and 28,000 verses. And then he wrote philosophical books also, and he wrote a tribute to his master, the person, his guru, or somebody who he calls his beloved, who was called Shamsuddin Tabriz. And he wrote a Divan-e Shams, right? So the Masnavi and the Divan-e Shams contain lots of different styles of philosophical poetry. Now, what he writes is he sometimes writes aphorisms, that is like 2, 3 sentences, which are pieces of philosophy, pieces of wisdom, parables, right, and so on. Then he writes stories. He writes stories about, just as we have in the Panchatantra and so forth, he writes stories about animals. He writes stories about people, like Aesop's fables or the Panchatantra. He writes those stories in verse, and at the end, he tells you what the philosophical punch of that story is, the moral of the parable, right? Sometimes they sound like Jesus' parables in the Bible. Sometimes they sound like Panchatantra tales. Sometimes they sound like Aesop's. So there are narrative stories and aphorisms. And then there are devotional poems to Shamsu Tabriz. They're not actually to Shamsu Tabriz, they are to God through Shamsu Tabriz. And when he says the beloved, he doesn't mean that he is in a gay relationship with Shamsu Tabriz. He means you are my means to realizing salvation, to realizing God. Because when he says the beloved, some American translators have taken the beloved to mean the girl next door or the person you fancy you see on the street. But that is not what the Sufis mean by the beloved. They mean God. They mean the essence of the universe. And so, what I have tried to do in all 3 volumes, and it's completely inadequate, I will admit that, is to select aphorisms, narrative poems, philosophical poems, and devotional poems, and give a proportion of each in each of these volumes. So, in this third volume, I've included all four categories: aphorisms, narrative stories, devotional poems, right? And philosophical poems, which are, of course, I could go on and write 20 more volumes. I don't think I'll do that, but the work is there in all these four categories. And I've just tried to give you a selection from each of the categories in the book.
Right, sir. So before we move on to other questions, in
Yes,
this book you talk about the story of how you encountered Rumi. You said having before heard of him but have never read him, and you say, and I quote, that he remained as closed a book as one of those from the Old Testaments whose names I knew but whose contents I had never bothered to access. And then your journey of translating him while realizing that 3 centuries before Shakespeare in the West was doing it, Rumi
yes,
was writing in the iambic pentameter style rhyming couplet. And the
exactly.
person who helped you with it is also the one you even dedicate this book to. So, for our audience, if you could please tell us that story and a little bit more on that, and how you encountered Rumi and the journey throughout.
Okay. I had heard of Rumi right through childhood. My father spoke a bit of Persian, right? Not that he spoke it out loud, but he knew Persian from school because being a Zoroastrian Parsi, he'd been to the kind of school that taught Persian. Anyway, and my Mamo, my mother's brother, my Mamaji, he also spoke Persian and was a great fan of Rumi's. So I had heard of Rumi, but had never opened a book of his or explored the poetry at all. I was on my trip to Australia, to Brisbane, to write a film. Somebody had commissioned a film in Australia. So as I drove to the airport, the person who was driving me, my literary agent in Bombay, Sorab Irani, gave me a copy of Rumi by American translators and to read on the plane. So it was the first time, it's a long journey from Bombay to Brisbane, and I opened the book and began reading it, and I thought, what the hell? This is not poetry at all. This is chopped up prose, mixed metaphors. Sometimes a beach is mixed up with a donkey, and so it makes no sense, and no rhyme, no reason, no no pentameter, no rhythm. So rhythm, rhyme, reason missing. And of course, there was some pretense in all the stuff of connecting the reader in a spiritual way with themselves. And of course, people fall for that, just as they fall for God men and so on. It struck me as a load of rubbish. I reached Brisbane, and instead of littering the bins of Australia, I brought the book back with me. And so I was sitting in my Mamaji's place in Bombay when I chucked the book into the bin. My my Mamu said, "What are you throwing this book away for?" He picked it up and he said, "Rumi, you're throwing away Rumi?" And I said, "Yeah, it's all rubbish." And he said, "How dare you say that?" And he began reciting Rumi from his memory. And I heard it. I couldn't understand. I could understand one or two words of the Persian, but he carried on. And I said, "Hold on, Mamu. This is iambic pentameter and rhyme." And he said, "What's iambic pentameter?" And I said, "It's the dum pa 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 do. And so on. And I said, it's the verse rhythm that Shakespeare used in his plays 300 years after Rumi. And he said, "I don't know about that. I don't care about that." And I said, "What does it mean?" So he started translating the verse that he'd just spoken. I said, "Give me some more in Gujarati, in Urdu, and in English." And kind of he struggled with it, but he was kind of in his memory just translating it literally. I said, "Please, can you hang on?" I brought my notebook out and wrote down what he was saying. That night, after he went to sleep, I turned the two, three, four, five verses that he had said into rhyme, iambic pentameter, rhythm, and tried to preserve the meaning. Next day, I said to him, "Can you say some more?" And he did. And so when I was staying in Bombay, those week or 2 weeks, he would every day recite something, tell me its meaning, and I would scribble it down. Then I put it all on my computer, sent it to my agent, and my agent said, "Fine, this is great. Um, uh, Somebody will publish it." They sent it to HarperCollins, and HarperCollins immediately said, "Yes, we'll commission the whole book. Just do it." Because they knew that Rumi was very popular all over the world. So I got a commission to write the book on the strength of these 6, 8, 10, 10, 12 poems that I'd translated through my uncle. And of course, I went back to London. I had a friend there called Mehmood Jamal. He and another friend called Firdaus Ali. They both knew Persian. They were, you know, and they would translate lots of stuff for me and select it, and I'd choose which ones I wanted. Then I said, "Give me narrative poems, give me philosophy, this, that," and I translated it with their help. And so the book came out. Then the second, of course, they demanded a second book. I wrote a second book. Then my agent thought the third book would also sell. So here we are. You have that. You have the third book with, again, an extremely attractive cover.
Absolutely. Farrukh, like you mentioned in your book, Rumi's great work, the Masnavi, sometimes, and as you said right now, is sometimes dubbed the Quran in verse. Many
Yeah.
translated versions of Rumi have been published and praised, and the most popular ones hardly bear resemblance to the originals. So, in a way, they have been highly diluted and secularized, if I may, to a commercially acceptable Western audience, and almost all of them remove his Muslim identity, which was the central theme of his poetry. Two questions for you on from that. Why is Rumi, a 13th century Persian poet deeply rooted in Islamic mysticism, the best selling poet in modern day America, surpassing, as you mentioned in your book as well, even canonical English language poets, despite the fact that most of his readers have little to no understanding of Islam or Sufism, a fact that you called astounding? And my second question, following up on that, is in your book, you ask if the followers of Rumi in the West, inspired by these prolific translations of his work, realized this absolute truth, as we talked about, that the spiritual and Islamic context of Rumi's concept of love is a metaphor for the divine union rather than a romantic or erotic longing, would they then turn away from the misrepresented Sufi Islamic message of his verse? Or would it still be splattered across poetry pages on Instagram or on iPhone covers, coffee mugs, and so on, offering motivation and daily wisdom? What do you think? My larger question is, how do you see him? In your books, you say that most of what is written about him is a myth. Three books down, what is Rumi according to you?
Okay. Your first question is, I mean, it's not easy to answer because why has he become the chief poet read in America? Now, to understand the mentality of Americans is quite difficult because they vote for somebody like Donald Trump and make him president, and J.D. Vance, for instance, because I can't fathom that. Why would they vote for somebody like that? So, somebody who's a criminal, somebody who's a misogynist, somebody who's a racist, somebody who talks rubbish, somebody who's obviously slightly mad. Uh, but the one thing one can say about America is that they are materialistic. It's a materialistic civilization and culture and society, and people yearn for spirituality. That's why Americans fall for godmen and people who give life advice, right? One doesn't need life advice. You live in a society, you live with people, you live with parents, you live with friends, you live with lovers, you live with strangers. You have to adjust to that by yourself. Why Americans need, and other people have followed them, lifestyle advice, I don't know. When people are religious, right? When you have a real religion, let's say like Islam or like Hinduism, right? You don't need God men, right? If you are a proper Hindu, you celebrate Diwali, you celebrate, uh, Holi, whatever. You worship Kali, you worship Shiva, you worship Brahma, Krishna, whatever. You know what you're doing. You have a cultural rudder, whereas the Americans have no cultural rudder. So what they do instead is, I mean, maybe the fundamentalists do, maybe, evangelical Christians have a rudder and they don't fall for it. But the rest of America falls for godmen and people who say that they are going to give them life advice. Do this and that, and you'll be happy. And it's all, to my mind, it's all a confidence trick. That's why Rajneesh, for instance, set himself up in America. Thousands of disciples. In Pune, my hometown, when he set up in Koregaon Park, thousands of people came from America and the West seeking I don't know, fulfillment of some sort. Same with Rumi. They read Rumi because it tells them that you are a spiritual being and not just a material consumer of goods. So it gives them a kind of self satisfaction. That's where the popularity lies. And the second reason is that when Rumi writes of love, of course, he's talking about love of God. He's never talking about love of another human being or his wife or his children, which he had. He had a wife and children, but or his father or mother. But he's talking about love of the ultimate being, the love of Brahma, if you like, because Sufi seems to have, I don't know if it isn't borrowed from there, but uh, there are kind of elements of the Gita in in Rumi's Sufi thought that the universe is one thing, the Brahma, and the Atma has to unite with the Brahma, as the Gita says. And so he's talking about that, but the Americans have mistaken his idea of love for, uh, Susan next door, or the person you saw on the train and fell for infatuated. So that's another aspect of his popularity. And then people like Madonna pick up this stuff, you know, without rhyme, reason, or rhythm, and start singing it. And when Madonna starts singing it, obviously people buy it, right? I don't, but lots do. And those are the reasons that I think he's a popular poet. And people who want to follow Sufi Islam, right, and are Sufi Islamists, they find a genuine reason for liking Rumi because he is the chief exponent of Sufi philosophy. Does that answer all the questions?
Yes, you did. But also following up on that, a very fascinating aspect that I noticed and that you also talk about in your book is that this heavily secularized version of Rumi, which among the Western audience is a symbol of the, say, the Western fascination with the Eastern mysticism, offering a godless, feel good spirituality
Yeah.
without the constraints of a, say, a mosque, a church, or a temple. However, contrasts with the Rumi that you talk about, who is, even with his Sufi Islamic identity, his roots, he is not conservative. He even uses blunt references to sexuality in his works and uses explicit terms to address compelling moral lessons. This stark contrast is both striking and it's also thought provoking. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this aspect.
Um, of course, the one thing, and I've said that, is the it gives the readers the idea that they are now spiritual beings because they can read Rumi. That's one thing. It's self flattery, right? And it's a kind of falsehood. The second thing is that it's a substitute for religious guidance. When you read morals, right? Uh, Jesus's parables. What are Jesus's parables about? When he writes in the when his disciples write in the New Testament about what he said, tells a story and then said the story means this. So it gives you a guidance on how to live. And so instead of reading a book called How to Live, you read Rumi's parables and it tells you a moral at the end. Not that people follow those morals, right? Uh, if the moral ends with, say, love thy neighbor, and you probably hate thy neighbor for taking up your car parking space outside your house, you don't start loving him. You still hate him for taking up the car parking space. But you read the moral and you think, I love my neighbor because. So there, in the narrative poems, there's always a parable, a meaning, a moral, and a conclusion with advice on how to live. And then you feel that you are following that advice, whether you do or not, right? It gives you the satisfaction that you have a kind of religious direction, right? Because you have no religion, you follow the morals of Rumi.
My next question to you is on the technical aspects. Two questions from that. One is, how difficult was the process of translation and ensuring that the rhyme and meter is in essence with the original poetry? How challenging was it to maintain that, and how do you then handle cultural nuances, colloquialisms, and puns like you talk about? How do you navigate that? And my second question is that, and I really look forward to your answer on this, is, with three books now on Rumi, how much does getting involved with the text and its translation impact you? Is there a Farooq before these translations and after these translations?
Okay. Um, your first question was how difficult is it to do? Now, what the truth is that a language always resonates with the culture, and the 13th century uh, Turkish Persian, right? Because that's where he lived. He lived in Konya, and he wrote in Persian, and of course mixed with Turkish and Arabic. Also, he knew uh, those languages and used them. Those cultures, the language refers to some assumptions of the culture. We live in the 21st century. We have our own assumptions in our own individual cultures, Indian or American or European or German or whatever. Even so, there is a kind of universal understanding in the century. And getting translating from one culture to another, it's not just translating a language from one language to another language, it's translating from another culture to a different one. And so in the translations, I used to actually go through an extremely meticulous process of asking my translator. In this book, Firdos Ali, my late friend, uh, he unfortunately died. I used to ask him, does this word have two meanings? Is there a pun in it? And he would explain to me that yes, it means this and it means also that, and it could mean this and it could mean that, and there's a pun in this, in that Ruby intends this pun. And I would explore words like that with him, and then he would write out in extremely bad English prose the meaning of what the poem was. And I had to decipher that and see what it meant, and then um, look for a rhyme that would express that as clearly as possible and stick to the rhythms. Um, Of course, I am not a poet. I'm a versifier at best, right? And so I've practiced that versification, and one has to uh, learn certain disciplines of versification. And of course, sometimes you express a thought in a line, and then you say, what the hell can rhyme with this and preserve the meaning of what Rumi is saying? You know, it's not just you have a rhyme ending in love, and the only word you can think of is above. And so, what do you do? How do you wrestle with it so that the meaning of what Rumi has said in that poem is not distorted by your obsession with rhyme? Yeah. And so sometimes I felt, screw it, I'm not going to rhyme. And then I think, no, I have to stick with it. So I let it gestate in my subconscious and come up with a different way of conveying Rumi's thought. Because conveying the thought of a poem, of a verse, is more important than anything else. But since I resolved to do it in rhyme and rhythm, uh, I I struggled with it and did that.
Before we end this conversation, I have one last question for you. Do
Please.
you have a favorite verse or a story of Rumi's that resonates most with you?
Uh, I don't think that there is one story, right, or one piece of aphorism or philosophy that really uh, resonates. But one thing I've translated one poem in two or three different ways, right, and that is a poem which Rumi calls the Song of the Reed, right? And the Song of the Reed occurs, I don't know if it's in this volume or in the last one, but there are two, three versions that I've done of the Song of the Reed, trying to preserve the same meaning. It's deeply philosophical, and if people are reading the books, I recommend that you look up the Song of the Reed.
Thank you so much. This has been an extremely enlightening conversation.